All right, so we're live. Hello
Hi.
everyone. Hello YouTube, hello Facebook, hello LinkedIn. Hello today on July 13th, 2022, or wait into the future in 3022 when this is in the archives of what happened, right? In this
Oh my
time of the
God.
world.
Wild. Yeah.
My name is Jodi-Ann Burey. I'm a speaker and writer who works at the intersections of race, culture, and health equity. I am so excited to welcome you to my Lit Lounge Author Talk. It's a series that's hosted by oneKIN, which is a mission-driven tech company that creates solutions to help small businesses and entrepreneurs gain more visibility and to grow. They have an online marketplace where you can purchase K-Ming's book as well as other books in my curated list in the Lit Lounge. You can learn about and purchase other BIPOC brands, authors, and other creatives. And so the goal of the Lit Lounge is to elevate memoirs, novels, short story collections authored by people of color about the nuanced experiences of our lives, both lived and imagined, which is why I'm so excited to talk to K-Ming today. Her latest short story collection, Gods of Want, so good. So good. It was published yesterday. And so happy Pub
Yes.
Week, K-Ming. Thank you for joining us. I know the tour might be a little crazed these days, but thank you so much for spending time with me and the oneKIN community. I just want to give a brief description. And of course, K-Ming, you'll describe this, but to level set everyone here, Gods of Want is described as startling stories that center the bodies, memories, myths, and relationships of Asian American women, from the National Book Award 5 Under 35 honoree and author of the novel Bestiary. And so welcome to the Lit Lounge, K-Ming Chang.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to talk to you, and thank you so much for that introduction.
Oh my gosh. I've been devouring these stories all week. I feel so special because this is my first book that it says like advanced uncorrected proofs.
Ooh.
That's how you know you've made it.
I feel really fancy when I receive those too. I'm like, whose book is this?
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
I want you to tell us in your own words, tell us about Gods of Want and how would you describe the collection of these short stories?
Yeah, I would describe it as a triptych because it's split into 3 sections: mothers, myths, and moths. And each section has kind of different thematic resonances that all connect with each other. But I would say the first section is focused a lot on matriarchal lineages and storytelling. And a lot of those lineages are kind of slanted or diagonal because I'm really interested in kind of expanding the definition of a lineage. And the myths kind of centers a lot of mythological creatures, a lot of uncanniness. And then the last section, in my mind, I'm like, that's like the horror fiction section, but it's probably not that horrific for people reading it. But to me, it's there's a lot of ghostliness, haunting, kind of the lingering nature of memory, and a lot of kind of embodied themes. Yeah, so I would say it's kind of I don't know, like a trifold.
Yeah, when I got to the moth section and you were talking about meat hooks in the basement, and I'm like, yeah, we're in a different place.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of subterranean. It's now like, okay, we're really gonna look into the void.
Yes, no, I love
Yeah.
that. I love that. And so across all the stories, I don't want to give anything away. Some of the stories are much longer than the others, so I feel like any detail that I can share might be too much. I don't know people's tolerance for spoilers. But I'm curious if there's one particular story amongst the collection that kind of still lingers, right? That kind of still
Hmm.
haunts you, that you think about more so than the others. And if so, why? What about it?
Oh yeah, I have a personal favorite child in this collection. I
Thank,
definitely
thank you
do.
for admitting that because some
Yes.
authors don't want to do that.
No, I do. And it's like a clear favorite. And I actually am really excited by this question because I'm like, please just love my favorite child. You don't have to read any of the other ones, but my favorite child, please love her. I
Uh-huh.
really love the story called Mariella in the collection, or
Mm.
maybe love is a bit simple. It's more, I feel very drawn to that story. And I find that that's the one that I'm most excited to read out from. It is from the last section, the mob section, which is actually my favorite because I feel like I get to be really weird in that section of the book.
It gets weird. I love
Yeah,
it.
which I really enjoy. And I think what I love about that story is there's a lot of themes of kind of adolescence, coming of age, and specifically kind of queerness and um, the intensity of a friendship that is this kind of double-edged thing where there's so much love and tenderness, but then also violence and a sense of peril or danger. And I really love misbehaving misbehaving girls and women is a genre that I just enjoy in all forms. And I found that writing that story felt so I don't know, liberating in a lot of ways. And I was constantly surprised by how far this story would go.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. Yeah, no. Speaking of liberation, for me, if I could share something from the first story, actually, Auntland.
Oh, yes.
And what was liberating about that is it's one of the stories that you play with structure a lot. It is the
Mhm.
whole story is one paragraph structurally, right?
Yeah.
And there's this repetition where you're describing aunts. And my mother is one of 10. And there's 5 girls, five uncles and 5 aunts. And all
Amazing.
the uncles have married women. So I have like 10 aunts just on this one side. And the way you're describing the aunts, it sounded like how I talk about my own aunts. Okay, so I had this
Mm.
aunt who does this, and then I have this other aunt. No, not that aunt, but the other aunt. And it's this way to
Yeah.
kind of like free up and almost normalize the women in my life. And I think like this expansion of mothering. Because even in the
Mm-hmm.
triptych of the mother section, the first story is about aunts,
Yes.
right? And so I would love if you would kind of speak to the structure of that particular story and the ways that you were working to expand this idea of mothering or motherhood.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, actually, that story came about because I think someone was commenting about how I'm always like talking about an aunt. Like I have an aunt who does this, and someone is like, "Have you noticed that every wild story that you've ever told begins with, I have this aunt who."
Yep,
So
yep.
it actually began as a writing exercise and a challenge for myself because I was thinking a lot about oral forms and oral storytelling and the way I began these stories with these women in my family. And yeah, it was totally purposeful too that the mothering section specifically began with aunts and also with the absence of mothers as well. There's one story about where mothering is kind of it's grief and it's loss. So I very purposefully that title is also a bit kind of like wink wink to the reader that it's not mothering in maybe the most traditional sense that we're told. Because I think for me, what I loved specifically about writing the aunt section is I really enjoy the ambiguity of like, oh, are these actual like blood relations or are these neighborhood aunties or are these friends' mothers, like, and to me that was almost irrelevant because I wanted to write this story where the relationship was defined by care and by a sense of responsibility, like a two-way sense of responsibility, and that's what defines that relationship between this girl and her aunts. It's not necessarily something as literal as or unimaginative as just like a strict nuclear family relationship. Um, there's this constant sense that these aunts are both very intimate presences, but also transient too, in a
Yeah.
way. And that at different stages and phases of your life, you have these different aunts, you have these different caretakers, and also people that you care for. And that to me was really important to define relationship by care, and sometimes that care is also harm too.
Yeah.
So there's this complexity, I think, of the relationships within this intergenerational family.
I love that. I'm actually getting goosebumps right now just listening to that, because what it also struck up for me, not only imagining my actual aunts, but as we're speaking, these fictive aunts, these people who have these mothering relationships in your life. But I am an actual aunt. I've been an aunt since I was 13.
Mm.
And like my eldest niece is in her first job right now. So I feel like I've seen it all. And my youngest niece is 4 years old. She hasn't even gone to school yet. And
Mm.
so I was thinking about the ways that I am a mother to so many people, and how do I provide care, and how could I avoid harm? And a lot of the harm could be unintentional, but just sharing ideas about the world that to them might be outdated. And so
Mm.
how do we think about care in so many different directions, and also kind of like the protective elements of having so many people transient too who care for you, like that's actually really important.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I'm just, like you said, I'm really interested in I feel like a lot of the kind of mothering figures in this book, their intentions are, one of care and love and this desire to protect. And I think how that becomes internalized by, the nieces, the daughters, the younger people in the family is really interesting. And I find that there's often, um, almost like metabolizing those
Mm,
memories or experiences into something that they carry with them. And oftentimes it gets metabolized into things that are maybe not the intention
yes,
of
yes, exactly.
caregivers. And yeah, I'm just really interested in that kind of like, what it means to receive and give. Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to give a shout out to Carol and folks in the chat right now that are just kind of raising up aunts and aunties, and just shout out to all the aunties, both real and fictive, in the relationships that we have. So I just wanted to call that out. So as you talk about metabolizing, this takes me to another question that I have to ask you. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of reoccurring imagery and words that are used throughout the story. So we talk about, there's a lot of melons. I was actually eating a watermelon as I was reading the story about the watermelons being shot up, and I was like,
Oh no, I'm sorry.
like this is a lot. Also, I love even so. This is such an aside. I'm so sorry. I eat watermelons in private because as a Black person, it is not safe to eat
Mm,
watermelons in public, right?
mm,
Just thinking about this like white gaze of
mm,
just being able to enjoy a piece of fruit, right? And
yeah.
I want to get to this question about metabolizing, but this watermelon thing is taking me down a different vein. Is that the gaze of this book is so almost disruptive of how we're supposed to, or quote unquote supposed to, or have been reading fictional stories, right? And so I
Mhm,
remember reading a story and I was assuming a gender for
mhm,
someone, and I had to actually go back and I'm like, there's no information in this story that confirms this person's gender. So why am I thinking that? And what I loved about the worlds that you were building is that it gave me permission to, or even not permission, but like to check myself and being like, you're in a different space right now. All that white gaze bullshit, like that is not what we're doing here. We're in a different world. And I'm wondering if you could kind of talk about the gaze in your construction of these worlds. And then I'm going to get back to this melon thing.
Oh, yes. Oh my God. I love that you mention it because I actually didn't realize the non-gender specifying part of one of the stories. Specifically, I think it's the Chorus of Dead Cousins.
Yes, that is
Until,
exactly the one.
yes, until I read multiple like published reviews that said a bride and a groom and referred to the narrator as a man. And
Yep.
it blew my mind. And not to fault these readers either, because I think I do love that we as readers bring our own kind of we bring ourselves to the page. So that's not to say I'm like discouraging people from interpreting or interacting with the page in the way that they they are and want to, but that did really surprise me. And I think especially because that story was first published in an anthology of queer fiction that McSweeney put out. So it was always written in mind for this queer audience and for this queer issue. Like, I wrote this story being like, I want to submit to this anthology of queer fiction.
Yeah.
Here's my contribution, please take it.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
yeah, I did have this kind of like queer gaze on this story. And even though the narrator is never referred to as a woman, and it was like something that didn't even need to be mentioned, because I was like, I know where this story could be and what it could be alongside, and therefore I don't even need to say anything. I don't have to clarify or put in indicators that they're both women getting married to each other. So yeah, that was so fascinating to me, and yeah, it's so interesting.
No, I love that, because like that is exactly the story, and literally I had to reread it because I'm like, whoa, what happened to your mind? Because I'm walking around like I'm an ally, I stand for my queer community, and I was like, well, your mind isn't there, because as soon as I walked into the page, I was bringing all of this like heteronormativity to it, and I was like, no, check that. And I think that can help train readers not just to approach fiction that way, but to approach life that way. Right now we're in this debate about people who have the capacity to be pregnant versus saying women, and it's like, ugh, get over this.
Yeah.
So
It is so much about language,
yeah.
which is so interesting. And yeah, it was something I didn't even realize, and it actually made me realize like the beauty of something like a queer fiction issue, because I felt like it created a space for me to write a story like this where it was going to be in community with these other stories, and I didn't have to feel like I had to write facing outwards and kind of defending and drawing like borders and lines around what this character is or could be. And I love that it was allowed to be ambiguous and allowed to be queer without having to like name it as something other. Like, I didn't have to other the narrator on the page. And I was like, oh wow, I'm really glad that is where that story first appeared. And yeah, it's interesting now to have it in the book, and to see what readers bring to it. Yeah.
So was that difficult to do that? And I'm asking completely selfishly, right? Because I'm working on a book now that extends my TED Talk. And the way that I tried to craft the TED Talk was, even though I know that this is going to happen in a majority white space, I want to write this in a way that feels that feels that it's happening from our gaze to or have to explain, right? But I also was surprised by how difficult it was to break out of writing for that gaze, even with something that like I was intentionally trying to not do that, and I had to remind myself of that all the time. Did you feel that tension, or do you feel like with your writing practice, you've set new norms of how to kind of tell these stories through your own gaze?
Yeah, I feel really lucky because I think that my work found people, like, the editor, my editor, my agent, my imprint, found people who kind of understood intuitively the kind of gazes it was centering, and also didn't like demand explanation in a certain way. Like, I remember with my first book, there was a conversation of like, oh, how much do you want to explain Taiwanese history, for example?
Yeah.
Like, how deep do you want to go into the logistics, like the years of this particular war, or this particular date? But it was always inquisitive. It was always curiosity. It was always conversational. It was never a demand or this sense of like, oh, pressuring you to do this because here's how the market is going to receive it, or here's how a reader is going to receive it. It was always like, oh, what would it look like if we tried this? And what would it mean for you or for the characters if we tried this? And I really appreciated it, that it was always a question, and it was always going back to the author and what you want as a writer and as a creator. So I think because of that, my writing practice I have been able to basically kind of write in a way that if I wouldn't explain it to myself, I wouldn't have the character explain it to themselves. And understanding, yes, there will always be certain nuances that are lost in other people, but I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And I find that in some ways, like all writing kind of asks that or creates that. So I try my best to kind of stay true to what the characters would explain or not explain.
Yeah. No, and I love that. And I think especially for folks that are watching this on LinkedIn, is that is possible. I think there's this expectation that if you're a person of color, if you have any identity that's been marginalized or undervalued, that you have to be fighting for your voice all the time. But no, there are people out there who can see the way you are seeing things, or at least trust your vision on something, and can be kind of supporting and pushing you in that direction. Like, we do not know if you're in a situation right now where you have to fight for your voice, maybe your voice shouldn't be there.
Yeah, no, seriously. And I think part of it too is like learning your boundaries too, and understanding like, oh, this is what's really important to me. And it's really hard to stay true to that
Yeah.
because I feel like as writers, it's like, oh, we do feel this pressure to want to like conform to certain expectations, even if they are imagined and aren't being blatantly told to us. So it's really difficult. Yeah, I think it's just a natural state of conflict that I've had to like learn to navigate and write through.
Yeah, for sure. So Christopher has a question, and I want to elevate that. So Christopher is asking if securing an editor and agent is a must when producing a first novel. Bestiary was a novel. Gods of Want is a short story collection. So just wanted to make sure that that was clear. But I guess we can say maybe like a first work.
Yeah, no, I think it really depends. I feel like different genres often have like different typical paths, but also all typical paths are just like they might just be the most visible paths to something, but they're not, you don't ever have to follow them. But for a novel, I finished the novel first and had kind of like a full draft of it, and then kind of started querying agents, and then my agent was the one who then submitted to find an editor. But there are definitely, presses where you can submit directly, and you don't need any form of representation. Though, of course, you want to be careful, like signing contracts and things like that, that you have someone in your court because,
Yes.
there are also like predatory people who may want to, who may not really have your best, your interests in mind. But yeah, and I think with for example, because like I came from a poetry world, so to me it was very unusual to have any form of like gatekeeping, because poetry was almost always you were just submitting directly and had your own manuscript and were either submitting to journals or submitting to presses. So I remember it was a big surprise for me to learn that in publishing there oftentimes is kind of like, or in fiction there's oftentimes more kind of gatekeeping in the world of fiction. But again, it depends. It really depends on the press. It depends on what route feels right to you. Because I definitely feel like if someone is saying, oh, well, if you don't get an agent, then it means your book doesn't exist or it's a failure or something like that. Like, I feel like that's really damaging and not true. Yeah.
Yeah. No, for sure. Thank you so much. And for folks that are watching, feel free to keep putting questions in. I'll try to integrate them as we go along. But I am going to get to the melon question, but one more detour.
Yes. Oh yeah. I forgot about that.
Okay. So as we're talking about gays, oftentimes that conversation happens between like a BIPOC gays or Taiwanese gays or women's gays, queer gays, white gays. I want to talk about like gazes even within communities of color, or even within this like huge grouping called Asian American, right?
Yeah.
So when I read the episodes of Hoarders, that is another piece that there is no punctuation in this at all. The structure is so exciting. Like, I think that I spent the most time highlighting and reading that one because it really forced me to pay attention to the particularities of the language. And then there was this one section that I misread the characters. I was like, oh, I think I see a Korean character, and I pulled up Google Translate, and Google Translate was like, girl, that is not Korean. And then I looked at it again, and I was like, okay, let me try Chinese, and then it translated it like visually. And I don't know if the translation was correct, but it said something like, what's yours is yours. And then I couldn't read the rest.
Yes.
So there's a whole, for people who haven't been able to get the book yesterday and finish it yesterday.
I know. It's been 24 hours.
It's been 24 hours since it was published. But there's a phrasing that's in these Chinese characters. And so when it popped up on my little phone that said, what's yours is yours,
yes,
I immediately was like, oh, this wasn't for me. You know, I couldn't read it. I felt like I was kind of, you know, like when you, I'm going to use this analogy because you talk about this room of the house so much without the stories, but it's kind of like when you open the door to a bathroom and someone's in it and you're like, oh shit, like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like that's how I felt when I read the Google Translate. And so I want, if you can speak to like that specific decision to use these characters for that like full phrasing, right? And also the ways that you overtly or even more subtly encode context that is like centered in Asian American women, centered in the Asian diaspora, kind of centered in queer experiences. Like there's a kind of encoding of these of the stories. If you could speak to that as well.
Yeah. Oh my God. First of all, I love that metaphor. That is such a brilliant descriptive metaphor. I'm like, oh my God, it's so fantastic. Oh, and then before I answer that, I also wanted to give a shout out to my agent and editor because I want to make sure I'm like, oh, they are the reason why this book exists. So I'm extremely grateful to them, and they're absolutely wonderful and people I feel totally safe with, and who are just so nurturing and supportive. But yeah, about this question. I actually, interestingly, went back and forth with the use of the characters. At one point, I had the translation. So that phrase, the first part is what is yours, and the second part is what is not yours is not yours. And my mom always tells me this, and she always prefaces it with, my mother told me this, and I'm going to tell you now. What is yours is yours. What is not yours is not yours. And I grew up with that phrase as kind of like a response to anything, like absolutely anything. Something like, oh my God, I, ran the mile and I thought I was going to come in first and I'm like the last in the class. She would be like, I'm going to tell you what my mother told me. What is yours is yours. What is not yours is not yours. Or sometimes it'd be like, oh my God, I'm so jealous of this person because she has this, or she did this and she accomplished this. That's what she would tell me. Or even if something really amazing happens where I'm like, oh my God, this got a review that is so brilliant. She would tell me, oh yeah, what is yours is yours. Yeah. So to me, it was this like constant chorus. And what was really interesting is that there was a kind of acceptance to it. And this idea that I guess in some ways people might read a kind of passivity into it, but I found it like incredibly comforting. And that there's this idea that, like, my mom would always also used to tell me, because I would get really anxious or nervous about things. Like, for example, maybe this conversation where I'm just like, oh, I'm so scared. And she would say, oh, it's already happened. You just have to go out and meet it. You have to go out and meet the moment.
Yes, Mom.
Yeah. She's like, it's already happened. There's nothing you can do that will change what is going to happen at this, when you take this test, when you show up to this, when you go on that date, whatever. Yeah. So just go and meet it. And I remember, and that was that kind of feeling that there was something, an essential mysteriousness to the world, and that could be something beautiful and not just something scary. Because I think the idea that we cannot control things is really terrifying, but it can also, on the flip side, be so thrilling and magical and wondrous. And so I did write it, and I was like, somehow I feel like the rhythm of it in English is not the same. And then I was like, oh, I could put it in Pinyin, but I was like, oh, but people in my family don't use Pinyin. Like, Pinyin is something that is, this standardized form of Mandarin that people of a certain generation learn, but not necessarily the people in my family who I would hear it from. So finally I was like, oh, this is how it was said to me. And this is how and it's funny too, because I don't read characters very well. So even to me, there's this sense of, when I look at it immediately, I don't necessarily feel an immediate sense of recognition that I've
Yeah.
seen this exact phrasing in these characters. But it felt really true, especially because it was the narrator texting. And I was like, oh, this is correct. This is the form that I want it to be in. And I also love, because it is something, it's one of the things in the book that's very personal to me.
Yeah.
I kind of like the idea that I flip to that page and I see it and I know what it is.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of like, oh, inside joke with myself and knowing this phrase.
Yeah.
That I feel like for the reader, it's great if they do know it and they do recognize it, but it's also not totally and wholly something that the story hinges on either. Yeah. So I love this idea of not being fully legible all the time. Like it's fine, you know, mysteriousness. Like I think that's so important in storytelling and on the page.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think we kind of circle around the importance of what I'm calling like big R representation so much. And we don't have the conversation that there's actually a price to pay and risks in being seen. And so I think it's so subversive to find ways to be legible in how you want to be legible, right? And not to worry as much about legibility, right? And that's why I felt like, oh, this was not for me. But I appreciate it so much as someone who like loves to see like Jamaican patois, for example, written down. I get so delighted by it. It's not a form that I've ever read, because Jamaican patois was not like it's not for the written word. So anytime I see it, I have to say it out loud, and I feel like what's coming out of my mouth is my mom, my dad, my aunties, like all my family in Jamaica. Like it's a way to kind of create community with them, which is way more important than if I were to use it in my writing, if that person understands what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I really love that. I think sometimes what gets lost in the conversation about big R representation is I was in an interview with Hala Alian, a poet who's really and a novelist, and she's really brilliant. And I think someone asked like, "Oh, do you feel pressure to kind of represent in a certain way?" And I think she said something like, "I think about imagination, or I think about transformation," and that really really resonated with me, because I'm like, oh yeah, it's not that I'm necessarily interested in representing something per se, because I think that can turn into like an ethnographic gaze of wanting to teach people. Like, I will show you, and you will learn.
Yes.
And I'm like, I'm kind of not that interested in learning through fiction. I do want to see, imagination, transformation. And I really love that idea that all writing is a form of invention. So there's this fear of, people have this fear of like, oh, I'm not authentic, or I need permission to tell my story. And I'm like, no.
Yeah.
Don't worry about that. Like, you don't need any permission, because it's all a form of fabrication. And writing into your imagination. I'm a big fan of inauthenticity.
Yes.
I'm like, invented languages, because that's I feel like we're constantly surrounded by that. And in fact, that's something beautiful. Rather than mourning like, oh, I don't have this, like thinking about, oh, but then in the absence of a language, or in the absence of a specific memory or context, like maybe something new can be invented. And that's a place of possibility.
Bars. Yes. Love it. Love it. All right. So I'm going to go back to my melon question.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So you have these like recurring images throughout the stories, right? Like there's a lot of melons, as I talked about 15 minutes ago. There are a lot of mouths, but not just mouths, but like tongues and teeth, and you talk about like hands, and often these hands are no longer attached to people's bodies, right? Fists and toilets, right? There's a lot of toilets in this. And I think, the collection, each of these words could be a little, mundane, right? But it's the body of it that caused me to like pay attention. Okay, what is she saying about wanting and the world and what we take from the world, what we're ingesting and digesting and excreting and regurgitating, right? Like it kind of speaks to this, like the cycle of like insatiable like wanting, right? And so I'm wondering if you could speak to like what you were hoping to convey from this like repetition and accumulation of these visuals, and kind of how we take in myths, right? And how we
Yeah.
take in what we should or should not be wanting from the world, and what we do with that.
Yeah. Oh my God, that was phrased so beautifully. I was like, I need to write this down. It was wonderful. Yeah. And I love that you use the word mundane, because that word really excites me, which is so funny because it means the
Yeah.
opposite. But I'm like, the mundane. Yes.
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
to write about the mundane. And I think what it is people are often like, they often highlight that my work kind of combines mundanity and magic. So something that seems like really ordinary, like a car wash or washing dishes or using the bathroom or, you know, getting dressed, or have this air of the magic or the divine or the strange or transformational. And I think for me, it really comes from my love of writing about domesticity in a certain way, because I think we tend to like belittle as a society domesticity. So what we consider women's work, cooking, cleaning, caring for bodies, caring for other people's bodies. And the domestic sphere is not typically something we consider particularly literary. We typically consider like something literary when it's like, you know, someone goes out of the house and does something.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in these women's worlds, in the sphere of domesticity. What does it mean to be kind of excluded from the world of the public, and to have this domestic sphere be the world that you live in and have agency within? Oftentimes in caretaking roles, or in roles of like cooking, cleaning, caring for bodies. And to me, I'm like, these domestic spaces are as magical and adventurous and wild and fraught as these other worlds that we typically consider more like worthy of writing about. And to me, it felt very natural to blend the kind of intimate details of the body, caring for the body, feeding, expelling, with the sense of like the collective and the cosmic, because I feel like, oh, that is the world, though.
Yeah.
We live the world in our bodies. What could
Yeah.
be more important and urgent than hunger or the need to expel ourselves?
Yes.
That is the world, you know, as real as like thunder in the sky, or anything kind of, any phenomenon that exists that we find so spectacular and interesting. So interiority and domestic worlds are super important to me in writing.
I love all of that, and I think that there's a previous version of me that would not be able to appreciate what you're saying right now. You know, so I for people who follow me, I had spinal tumor, blah blah blah. But I was hospitalized for almost a month, and I'd never had that experience before, and as an adult. And so while people are like, "Oh my gosh, your surgeon did all these incredible things," I'm like, "Do you know what was incredible? These nurses, day in and day out, like taking care of my body, right? The first week I was in the hospital, I wasn't able to get into a shower. Just like the logistics of getting me into a shower were intense. And so it was like the 7th or 8th day where they actually got me to like sit in the shower, and this nurse, who no one told her to do this, she was like, "Have you showered yet?" And I'm like, "No, I haven't." And she was like, she like took the time to like to work everything out to make that happen. And K-Ming, when the water just touched my body, like I could cry right now of just
Oh my God.
like how magical that felt, right? And
Yeah.
I think about that moment so much, right? I think about those tiny little moments so much, and how almost like spiritual they felt, right? I had a couple of nurses who did these like simple, beautiful things for me, and I'd never seen them again. So they almost felt like angelic, or like, you know,
Yeah.
ghostly.
Yeah.
So you're when you're saying this, like that's who I'm thinking of. These like
Yeah.
transient like women who poured everything into me for like 10 minutes, and
Mm.
how much that helped me. And I felt that like so reflected in
Mm.
this, like, of, as you're talking about the domesticity and kind of marrying this with these kind of surrealist magical elements, like it hit right away. And I think anyone who's ever been cared for, which if you're alive right now, somebody has had to care for you in that way,
Yeah.
at some point. I hope this resonates with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So, oh, did you want to say something about that?
Oh no, thank you for sharing that. I was like, oh, I was really deep in that memory with you.
Okay. I
The
appreciate
water.
that.
Yeah.
So I want to switch gears, and for folks who are watching, feel free to add in your questions in this. And Jenny from oneKIN is on the line. If you can also put the link for K-Ming's book, I really want people to get your reading on, right? Um, Switching gears, still talking about the body, but not in that way. um, there, I don't. There's. I don't know why I didn't expect this. I don't know. You just seem you seem so nice, and you have these birds, and so I don't know
Yeah.
why that's like a conflicting idea of like this book. Dare I say, there's some moments that are a little sexy.
Oh yeah. Oh, it is though. It is though. I really deep down am a romance writer. That really.
I
I
I felt that.
yeah. I was that child who I would go to the library, go to the paperback romance section, like the mass market paperbacks,
Mm-hmm.
flip through the book, read only the sex scenes. I did this so often and so frequently that I knew, even just looking at the edge of the book, where the sex scene would be, like the climactic one, because I had
It
read
would be
so many. Yeah,
yeah,
I would know. Well, I would know. I was like, okay, it's going to be this many pages in, because they're
yeah,
always this many pages in, and I would literally be correct
yeah, yeah.
every time. So I was completely that person who I was like, oh, I want to get to the intimacy, to the sex scene. I love a literary sex scene.
There was some sexy moments where they're like, oh, I wonder what if she tasted where her tongue did. I was like, ooh, child. Hey, man.
Yeah.
And so I want to talk about that a little, because like when we think about desire, when we think about wanting, I think it's easy to go to these spaces of like our sexual desire or our romantic desires, right, as part of these like wants that we have as human beings. And so I'm curious, in addition to that, how were you exploring like other desires and other wants that we have throughout these stories?
Yeah, definitely. I think pleasure of so many forms is in this book. And I'm really interested in the kind of boundarylessness of these various pleasures. And I love using kind of an excess of language. I love using like metaphorical language, imagery, because I find that there's something so pleasurable about that excess, which also feels very queer to me as well, to have this kind of like surplus and excess of pleasurable language. So I
Yes.
wanted so I wanted the reading itself to be this kind of pleasurable experience of language, and at the same time to be exploring things like hunger and desire, both sexual and also kind of like spiritual desires as well, and kind of things that are more ephemeral. And those things are often really tied together. And I'm really interested in what environments can these characters articulate that desire, and in what environments is that kind of dormant, or something that happens only in the interior. To me, I think desire is so much the space of the imagination, and I've always found queerness to be also so much about imagination as well as like this act of imagining. So it feels very, I think, right for the characters. Like, I feel like before I consciously understood or thought of queerness, like I was having dreams about transformation, about these kind of improbable situations. And I'm just really interested in that kind of mind beneath the mind and what it can reveal about ourselves. And I know I mentioned the car wash earlier, but there's like one scene of two girls going through a car wash, and they have this like very intimate sexy moment when they're going through this car wash. And I really loved like playing with the imagery of like water, like running down over the car, and this space, it's this tunnel. So they know they're going to come out of it and kind of be exposed again to the world. But for a moment, they're in this place of like submergence and imagination. Like one of the girls is like, I feel like I'm in the mouth of a whale.
Yeah.
So I really enjoy that there's, in desire, I think, is possibility and potential. And I think that's essentially what desire really is. It's not even just about like, oh, getting what you want and being satisfied. It's like, oh, what is possible for me and for us? Yeah.
Yeah. I cannot imagine what our world would be like if we didn't have like this, like, I don't want to say queer people, but just like this queering approach to life, because I feel like that is where like the most radical, quote unquote radical, but like pushing our culture forward, right? The best questions are coming out of these spaces, right? I'm really trying to push these like fake confines of what does it mean to be like, what does it mean to express our humanity, right? What else is out there? What more is possible? And this kind of like constant wanting and this accumulation, like I see that in these stories. And I see that in this like magical realism too, because things are happening in the book where I'm like, okay, in my world and in the rules of like reality, there's no way that I could have these like ghosts and other people see them and you know, kind of treat them as fact, right? And treat this as normal. And it's almost this point where it's like, yeah, I got it. And then it goes off the edge and no one else besides me, the reader, thinks that what's happening is weird. Right. And I love that because I'm like, yeah, why couldn't she eat a person? Like why? You know? Like, why couldn't you have ghosts? Why couldn't, you know, these things actually be real? And I can feel myself as a reader kind of like the tension of like what is happening here, and then also the relaxation of literally anything can happen.
Yeah, I love that so much. And there's a book of like queer theory and essays by a writer named Jose Munoz, and he calls queerness a horizon of being. And I just, when I hear it, I have like these chills, and I just think the horizon of being. And he writes about how queerness is something that has yet to happen, that it's in some ways perpetually future facing, which is interesting because I think usually people talk about queerness as kind of like, oh, an end to something futureless, you know, because like, oh, if you don't have children, then you have it's a futureless world, all these things. But what I love about that book, what I find so radical about that book, it's talking about like queerness as this dawn, that it's always out there and we can glimpse it, but it's the perpetual future. And I'm like, oh, what could be? That's so glorious, and that's so interesting. And let's write toward that and into that. And I think kind of in relation to that, I'm so interested in writing about desire in all its forms, because to me it is writing toward that horizon, where I feel like so much, especially because I'm really interested in writing about women and girls. Like there's so much a message of denial, I think, in the way that the world raises girls, of like I remember being taught, like, don't take compliments, you know, never, like if someone says something, say, no, I'm not, or no, I refuse that. And that's the same with desires of all kinds. There's this sense of denial or withholding knowledge so that you won't have desires, or won't have access to your wants. And I was like, oh, what does it mean? Okay, this is kind of a weird, like, denial. Like to say no to that and write fully into desire and wanting. And for me, it is this feeling of kind of like falling into the water or something like that, where it's just like, it's endless, it's bottomless.
Yeah. And I think if you like approach your writing that way, right? Like stories, and I know these collections are not developed linearly. Like you're like, this is going to be my first one, and this will be the second, and this is kind of what I'm doing. And so I'm curious, like, as you approach writing with this, like, to the horizon, with this bottomlessness, right? Like you could have had double the amount of stories in this collection, right? I'm curious, as you were putting the collection together or even developing the characters or the stories, and you're kind of seeing what is possible, was there anything that kind of surprised you along the way?
Yeah. Oh, completely. And I love that word developing, because it does almost feel like waiting for a photograph to kind of develop, rather than the more linear piece of like, what's the beginning, what's the middle, what's the end, and how do I get from beginning to end? It was more like every story was a landscape, and I was just waiting for things to emerge in that landscape. And it didn't matter whether it was like a memory flashback, or if it was something that was happening in the future, if it was the first sentence or the last sentence. It was all just like this landscape of language. And I just needed to figure out like what goes where in that landscape. There's a poet in Yang Yi who talks about like writing as gardening. And I really love that. And I was like, oh, you're right. Like, I feel like it is kind of, you nurture this plot of language, and you see what grows out of it. Yeah. So for me, a really like uncanny thing that happened to me when I was writing these stories is there were two stories in particular that I was really struggling with. One of them is the Nuwa story about the snake train. And then the other one, I forgot the other one, but there were two stories I was really, I think it was Dykes. Yeah, Dykes.
Yeah.
And I was really struggling with those. So I remember I was sitting on edits where I was like, oh, I don't know if I should send them back to my editor. I'm really worried. Like, I didn't do anything to them. I'm like, I edited them.
Yeah.
I changed the sentences. And then I remember I was like, okay, thinking about it in circles is not helping me. So I'm just going to set it aside, and I'll look at it next week. I'll look at it 2 weeks from now. We'll see what happens. I just can't, I'm just so sick of it.
Yeah.
And so I left it alone for 2 weeks. And then one day I was like, oh, I'm going to open up a blank page. And I love flash fiction. For me, flash fiction generates so much for me, because I'm not thinking about like a means to an end. I'm kind of just being present for the moment. So I wrote this flash piece, and I was like, oh, that was really fun. And then I wrote a second flash piece, like almost consecutively, which never happens. I was like, oh, that was really fun. And there were these two paragraphs, each about, 800 to 1,000 words. And I looked at them and I was like, something about this reminds me of something else. And so I ended up dragging the first paragraph into Nuwa and the second paragraph into Dykes. And that was it. Like, the stories were ready. And I'd used different character names and different POVs when I was writing those flash pieces, but they were the exact pieces that I needed for those two stories. And I remember being so shocked by that. I was like, how did that happen? Like, was my mind dreaming about it all along? Like, was it just that I needed to wait and let it emerge? Like, what was going on? But it is very much like gardening or letting something develop, where these other elements kind of came out when I wasn't thinking about the stories at all. And I realized, oh, these were the questions that I needed for these stories. And I just put them into their parts, and they're almost unchanged in the published book.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Oh my gosh. Okay, we're wrapping up on time. First of all, this whole lit lounge thing, I will tell you this. This is my secret agenda.
Oh, I love that. I'm a big fan of secret agendas.
Because I'm writing right now, right? And what you're describing, this like being stuck and just kind of figuring out, like, I'm sick of it. I got to leave it alone. I got to do this. I'm in that right now, and I'm like, oh, I'm only asking these questions because I'm interested.
Oh yeah. No, I do that too all the time, where I'm just like, so tell me about that story.
Yes. So like, if I was like, what is your writing process? When do you write? When do you this? Like, these are only things I care about, like, right now.
I love that.
So actually, for the writers in the room, myself included, but for other people who are wanting to write, who are writing right now, is there anything that you've learned that you would want to share with folks, just about like the business of writing, or the writing process, or ways that you struggled, continue to struggle, that you want to just kind of share with the writers out here?
Oh, that's so good. I have one. So I had a professor named Jodi-Ann Chang who once told me, and at first I felt so called out by this. She was like, Oh, writing isn't an identity, it's a practice.
Mm.
And I remember thinking like, was that directed at
Yes.
me?
So
But
what
the
you trying
more,
to say? I don't
yeah,
practice?
I
Like,
know, I know exactly. But I think I love that so much because I was like, I think there is so much pressure that you have to earn an identity as a writer. That a writer is something, it's like a status. And once you have it, then you have it, but you have to like constantly try to earn it. Like it's something you have to deserve, like something being published that makes you a writer, winning an award that makes you a writer, all these things. But the idea of being a writer is a practice that makes it so much more accessible and less about like milestones that are out of your control. And it also kind of reminds me of martial arts movies where you see them like sparring with a wooden dummy, and it's just daily practice. It's almost like a prayer or a ritual. It's this practice in their lives, and it's not always a means to an end. Like to bring the martial arts thing.
yeah.
It's not just like to beat someone up or etc. Like there's this sense that the practice itself is its own thing, and that there's nothing to earn or nothing to deserve, and that really is so liberating to me. And I think holding on to that and understanding that I could treat the page in a way that's low stakes and playful and a practice, and that I don't have to prove myself to anyone has been really, really liberating to me because that creeps in all the time.
Yeah, that is, yes, amen. Like, absolutely. Thank you so much, K-Ming. Thank you so much, oneKIN, for opening up this space. Thank you for everyone who's watching this now, who's going to watch this 1,000 years from now. I appreciate this community so much. And K-Ming, I mean, come on. You wrote the hell out of this. And so thank you so much for your work.
Thank you so much. This was the most wonderful, inspiring conversation, and I just had so much fun. And also, good luck with your stuckness as well. I hope those parts of your subconscious, are able to.
Do you see me gazing out into the void?
Yeah.
Looking for hope and answers.
Yes. I know, exactly. They'll come out the horizon of being. It's out there. Your book, you know what? It's like what my mom says. The book is already done. It already exists. Now you just have to go out and meet it.
I'm just going to meet it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. All right.